Yep.
Okay. Change August 1st. And they kind of look the same. When you look at the cover, you'll notice that one is H25, which is your closing disclosure, not a HUD, but a closing disclosure. And your other one is H24, which is your good faith estimate. Or, I'm sorry, that'll change as well. That'll be your loan estimate, not a good faith anymore. So 2 to each table, roughly. I wasn't sure if you guys had seen these again, so I figured maybe you've already seen them and didn't need to, but I didn't print off very much. But basically what most of you, I'm sure, have heard, and I'm going to use notes because this is a condensed, shorter unless you wanted to sit here all day, but probably not. So basically what happened was we have the CFPB. Everybody's heard that? Okay. Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer. This is because naturally the market crashing a few years, so now they've put in some new regulations and they've appointed a guy named Richard Corday to be the director of the CFPB. The CFPB basically looking after the consumer. That's the bottom line. Or some people want to say they are now punishing the banks because of the things that went on. So what the CFPB has in place, new educate the consumer, because with the market crash, most of the consumers were, oh, I didn't understand I had that kind of loan. Oh, I didn't understand about my adjustable rate going up. So in lieu of all of that, what they've done is they have now created different documents to help disclose things to your buyers and your borrowers. So most of you are aware of RESPA disclosures. You had your truth in lending disclosures. You had all of your disclosures. And what they've decided to do was take good faith estimate, your truth in lending disclosure, and your HUD-1 and make them one document. So now most of us are looking at this with a new closing disclosure statement. That is your new settlement statement. That is the new, call it a HUD-1 anymore. We call it a closing disclosure statement. This is the new document that's going to take place of the HUD-1. Now there's two things really that as realtors, there's a few things that you need to be concerned with. Now there's all these things that are going to be happening in the background, but as agents, the one thing that you need to be aware of, what these new documents look like and what it means as far as you going to, and it's not settlement anymore. You will no longer be going to a closing. You will no longer be going to the settlement table. We are now contract. So with all of the new changes, yes, all of the terminology that you're used to seeing on your deeds, like lenders, borrowers, all of the terminology is changing, and essentially to make it easier for people to understand. So, so you have things that are changing, like creditors, lenders, specific names that you'll start seeing on all of your documents. They're going to start changing. So a lender will be a creditor. So little things like that are going to change. If you look on your, if the documents that you've passed out, there's two. The loan estimate, which is basically now going to be once you have a contract or once somebody speaks to their loan, the initial conversation there is going to have with a lender. There are a couple things that can happen. So when your borrower talks to a lender, if they give out their name, their income, their social security number, the property address, and an estimated value of the home, in that conversation, if those things are revealed, a loan out. Because we now take things very serious. So you can't really have that conversation. The lender's not going to be having a bunch of conversations over the phone before they're mailing out this loan estimate. Because the most important thing is that when that information is exchanged and your borrower has contacted the lender, it's going to initiate that loan estimate. This immediately. So the lender is going to send this loan estimate out to the borrower. It's not the good faith loan estimate anymore, but it is an estimate of the charges. So at this point, what's going to happen is your lender has a platform that they have generated to now work with the settlement company. So regardless of who the settlement company is, and let's just say you're getting a loan with Wells Fargo is going to upload everything to a platform. The settlement company can then form, and off this platform is where they're going to communicate and exchange information. And basically, your lender, in most cases, is going to be preparing the closing disclosure. So basically, what's going to happen is your settlement agent is uploading all of this information, and they're usually preparing the HUD-1. You're used to contacting the settlement agent, but that's not going to happen. This closing disclosure is going to be prepared by the lender. The lender then has to get this closing disclosure out to the borrower. Now, there are different methods that can be done. Mailing, of course, takes 3 days. That's what they're considering when they mail this disclosure out. It's going to take 3 days to get to the buyer. Going back and forth on this disclosure, whether it can be email, it's not going to count. Who's checking whose email. So there's certain things that are going on that we're not too sure of what's going to say, yes, I've got the documents. So what you're concerned with is basically when these people get the documents and they have their closing disclosure, they have to have it for at least 3 days. You are not going to closing until days after that document is prepared. So you guys are all used to a world of where your HUD-1 may come down the day before closing, that morning, noon, if you're lucky the day before. It'll be done 8 days in advance now. So because what happens is it takes 3 days to mail it out. They have to have it for 3 days. Because we count business days, and it's kind of the same world if you're used to the right of rescission with refinance, how you have that if a bank's open on a Saturday, it'll count a Saturday. If it's not open, we're back to those same rules. So you're going to have to check with their lender, what days are counting during those 3 days, to know exactly when to time your settlement. So what will happen is you will have this closing disclosure. They'll get it. They'll have 3 days. Now, the problem here is that if there are any changes to this closing disclosure, starts all over again. So it goes back, it gets changed. Once it gets changed, it gets mailed out. They receive it. They have it for 3 days. So basically, the days of the last minute closing are over because they will have these documents all in hand. Now, there are some fees, and they're called bucket items, but there are some fees that are absolutely positively not allowed to change, and it will trigger the whole 3 days back over again. There are little fees that can have a 10% variance, like recording charges. Things that really aren't anything that we're going to run into. It might be like 10%, a couple cents off on recording something. And in that case, it's fine. You don't have to go through that process. But to be honest with you, for anything that you're going to have, any kind of walk-through items, any kind of little changes like that, anything that's going to affect the buyer's bottom line by anything is going to trigger you want to make sure that you're on top of it. Or I know that we've had some discussions on be prepared to do rent backs if it goes longer than what it's supposed to. So there's been some talks going on to how what are we going to do, because of course come August and September, when these it's taken a little bit more time, we're going to have issues and people are going to be unprepared to wait those additional 3 days, 6 days. So you're kind of looking into some longer time frames. Are some loans that are not going to be subject to these changes, which are like HELOCs. Those aren't going to be subject. Reverse mortgages, they are also not subject. But for the most part, anything that, or cash, but for the most part, your hard lender money, you're going to have to go through this process. There are going to be some cases, especially if you're dealing with your local banks or your credit unions, they may be preparing the closing disclosure, but the same rule is going to apply. They may prepare, or they may have the settlement company prepare it. It's still going to have to go out for the 3 days. It goes out in the mail. They have to have it, and then they wait the 3 days. So you're still going to be subject to all those time frames when you're looking at going to closing. So those are really, the timing is the big issue that's going to affect all of you. Yes. Well, the interest rate lock is still going to, you're going to have your good faith estimate, and the lock is still going to be, my understanding is that, and I think I have it on here as far as much time is required, but once they lock, at the time that the good faith estimate, the good faith, but what are they calling it now? I'm sorry. Once the loan estimate, once that goes out, I think the lock, I mean, as long as they, I mean, if it closes, it should be getting to in that time frame. Are you saying if it keeps going and? I see what you're saying, and that's a good question, and I don't know all of the answers, so I have my card here so that you guys can email me so that I can also pass any questions on that I can't answer because this is so new. Yes. Yes.
Just to clarify, basically right now we would suggest 45 to 60 days. If there is an unforeseen circumstance, we have the option to basically, we can get extension fees and so forth. Closer than anything. So they don't have to lose their lot. They can actually get extension fees. Okay. And it's nominal enough where we work at, so we'll be prepared. So, we'll just have to allocate this. I would not do anything short of it.
Yeah. Right.
It'll 45 days. It'll be, so the rates will probably adjust. It's not, it's probably 8 some point in price. Is it going to be 30-day lock, 45-day price at 30 days? No, it's going to be a 40 because your investors have to go out and get that 40 days.
So it can be done in 30 days.
If it could be, yeah, I would say, I would not count on 30 days to close.
How many days? Would not count on 45 days?
45, I would say 40.
Oh,
I'm talking
okay.
about the locks. We're not talking about closing. We'll do what we can, but it's time frame. You want to make sure you can.
Yeah, and basically it's just a matter, we're all kind of used to functioning, right before the close. But because the information has to get to the lender right away, it'll flow. I mean, the nice thing about it is you will have the HUD-1s ahead of time, or the closing disclosure. So, they'll be able to see it. And of course, if you take a look at it, it's supposed to be simplified. I'm not necessarily sure how simplified it is, but a lot of settlement companies, this is not including, so if you see your disclosure here, so you're still going to have whatever they choose to use for the settlement side. There'll be some companies may choose to use like a seller's HUD-1 or the seller's disclosure. So the seller still has their own set of documents. This is your buyer's documents here. This is what the buyer's HUD-1 is going to look like. And it kind of rearranges the fees a little bit. So what'll happen is when you're a lender, one of the things that when the lender sends out the loan estimate, they also have to send out a list of service providers that have been vetted by them. So some of them will be optional. They can, you can use them. Your buyers can select from this group, or your buyer, if they want to document that sending to your buyers, which are going to be a list of vendors that they can use that they have personally vetted so that they can pick from those services. So that out with that good faith estimate is this list of service providers. Yes, no, any services. Because what's happening is from your state, but what's happening is there is now accountability. So a settlement agent, the rules really have complete, as far as like the innards, what you're doing now at the settlement company, it's just network security's gotten tighter, email. So the industry for the settlement companies is really changing tight. And they also now, lenders have to be responsible for the settlement companies they have to be responsible for their vendors. So everybody now has to be what we call vetted. And so basically what it is if Bob's office over there had somebody that he was using that did some repairs, or he was referring this guy out, but really didn't have anything on file about this guy, didn't know much about him, they're just kind of friends, that's going to pose a problem. You can't do that anymore. This person, now Bob at his office has vetted this person. Bob has now looked at his licensing and his insurance. Bob is now, if he's referring people to this gentleman, he has to vet this gentleman. So it's the same with the lender. Anybody that the lender is using, surveys, is now vetted, and they are going to babysit. So basically there's a lot of babysitting that's going to be going on. Settlement company is going to be babysitting everybody. The lenders are going to be babysitting the settlement companies. So like with Stewart, what we've done is, we're working with Wells Fargo, Bank of America, like the bigger companies, to kind of figure out like where the industry is going to change, what direction they're going in, who's going to be responsible for what. And so there's still a lot of that going back and forth right now. But the bottom line is that they're cracking down and things are getting strict. Yes.
So how does that affect us as agents? We're then considered vendors also, right?
Well, you are not how do they say? They don't assert authority over licensed real estate brokers, auto dealers, manufactured home dealers, and accountants and tax preparers. Those are the people that are not watched by the CFPB. So, yeah. Right, but you may want to be cautious if you are referring people, because the thing is if you refer your client to use Jim, is working, with the lender that Jim. So basically the lender is going to say, well, he's not on my list, or he's not vetted. So whatever he's doing for the house, I don't want any responsibility. I'm not going to be responsible for him, because you actually have to vet your people. So if you are going to refer people to use them, I would make sure that you pass along that vetting. I know this guy, he's licensed, here's a copy of everything. You need to kind of share that with the people that you're working with. But on a personal level, I would not want to be referring somebody just to my friend that we haven't checked his license, because now there's also background checks for everybody that's employed in this industry. I'm not sure how it is with the real estate agents yet, but as far as everybody that's doing settlements, everybody that's in a settlement office, including the secretary, everybody has just now gone through a background check, or should, by the 1st of August. Yes.
One standard, or do you think
Okay, right now we have one that's called Closing Insight. That is the big one, not like Bank of America, Wells Fargo. That is what they're going to be using. And a lot of the agents have already registered for that site. Then there are some other ones and the Closing Insight is like a free porthole where everybody can share information. There are some smaller banks that could easily send to a settlement company, you need to download our platform and use our platform. So there may be some lenders that are going to require that you use their own personal platform. And that's kind of where you go out and get the closing package and put in the, password and print off the document. So for the most part, Closing Insight is what most of the bigger lenders are going to use, but there's still that possibility that there may be individual programs. Yes.
Does any of this affect cash buyers?
It doesn't.
Will their HUD look like this then? I mean, will it look like what, or they use the old HUD?
It's really going to be up to actually my understanding is that there will be new HUD documents put into place, and so it could be a variation of what that settlement office is using and what software program that they're using as to what kind of document that they might generate. So I think after a while, things are probably going to, after they start test running in August, you'll find that the industry, everybody will kind of have their own thing to begin with, and then the industry will probably change and go back to everybody using exactly a seller's HUD that looks like this, and then the buyer's HUD will, look like this. So, but I think at first it's going to take some time, because how it is right now is, as long as you're compliant and everybody's got their software providers that are making them compliant, but all these documents are not going to look the same until this, until it goes into effect.
As agents, when will we get a copy of this? Will that be given to us by the lender, or do our clients have to forward it to us?
Okay, so the lender is responsible in most cases for sending this out if they've prepared it. And in some cases, if the settlement company, because see, the unfortunate side of this is that even though this is done by the lender, the settlement company still has to do it. Because it has to be in the settlement company's system so they can disperse the funds according to a document that the lender made. So unfortunately, even though this is done, the settlement company has to redo it. So it would probably be like in your best interest to talk to the settlement companies to find out exactly when you can get a copy of this, because you should be able to, and I don't know, but I would assume that when the lender sends this out, they're also going to send the copy or put it on the closing platform to the settlement company. And in that moment, as soon as it's prepared, everybody should be able to access it. But you might want to talk just to see exactly when are you guys allowed to have this document, or, who do you get it from? Do you get it from the lender, the settlement company? And see, those are kind of little tricky questions that we're not too sure yet. We don't even know, like when this test runs off, how well it'll go over those first few closings because it's going from one system to another. And that's the other problem, is that all the TSS, RamQuest, those are all their Soft Pro, all those programs that we use for settlements. They all are going to have their own way of entering in all of this. So we have all these new software changes going into effect, and we haven't seen anything yet. So we haven't.
It's supposed to start August 1st.
It's supposed to start August 1st, and we have nothing in, like, as far as software providers go, do we have anything in stone yet saying, oh, here's ours, it's done, this is what's going to look like. So that's still to come. Yes.
So in other words,
Right.
I have
Right, exactly.
and regarding the 3 days. Do you think that that'll be changed?
Yeah, I have,
It seems really odd. How difficult is that? I mean, what if it takes 4 days to get there?
well, and the thing is they're accounting. So when they say that they've mailed the disclosure to the buyer, they're saying mail takes 3 days. Now, it could take 4, which pushes it back another day.
So there's like a return receipt.
No, there is not, but they will acknowledge, because what they're saying is if you've mailed it to the buyer, they have it in 3 days. They're making that assumption. They are making that assumption that it's gone out in the mail and the buyer has it in 3 days. Yes, and however, there has to be written procedures in place before that can happen. And those are some of the things that they're trying to work out, is that the buyer goes in, picks up the load. Now, he has to have it for 3 days. So you kind of get rid of the 3 days mailing time. You're still just doing your 3 days in waiting. But they're working on things like that, because in some cases, if they are somewhere else and getting it by email. So they're working on trying to validate these things so that you can actually use email and but right now we're still up in the air. So what they're basically saying is, for instance, if you want to close Monday, you need to make sure that the Monday before everything is done. So if you have a closing, basically count it 7 days out. I got a closing next Tuesday. Well, today is a week out. I need to make sure that every phone call is made, the closing disclosure is out in your hands, and we're scheduled to go, no changes. So a week before your closing date, that's the drop dead date. That's the date you want to make your calls, make sure everything is out of your hands and done and completed. And then we're going to wait 3 days for them to get it, 3 days for them to review it. We're going to closing. Yes.
Right. And there's no receipt.
Probably not, because you're not being watched. You're not covered under the CFPB. So
What I'm thinking is that the contract says within
most people do it that day.
Right.
So you can do the walkthrough 3 days before Sunday. But would anybody do that? Because then you have the third day.
Right.
You tell the sellers, for instance, to be out.
Right, and that's why we're talking, that's why we're saying that there are little quirks that are going to have to be worked out. I mean, because what if you're right, a lot of times, you've escrowed for repairs, or the, seller's gonna give $500 to the buyer, that's gonna trigger 3 more days.
Trigger a lot of under the table.
It's gonna trigger.
It's not legitimate. It's activity.
It is 6 more days, yes, it's because they have to fix it, mail it out, and send it off, so it's another, yes, essentially a
So
week.
even if you did check, you got your documentation, you check it 6 days out, if there's a change that needs to be made, from that point, you're talking minimum another 6 days.
Exactly,
So
so
no
let's,
changes can be made at the settlement table.
yes, there can be, and it has to be only on a reporting charge or a fee that's 10% changed, but it's not gonna be anything that most likely you would be concerned with. It's gonna be a recording charge, there's like a little list of charges, and it can only change by 10%.
Or
So,
less.
or less. So anything that, triggers that is going to trigger that whole process over again.
So seller side of the HUD-1 can change.
Right, the seller's,
Without any disclosure.
Right.
So their side can change. So
yes,
the buyer side, so if they get credit in their balances, basically what they're getting back, or what they have to bring to closing goes down, would that still be considered a change?
a change is going to be anything that's going to trigger the APR to adjust, which would be your closing cost, yes, by 10%. So there's a 10% variation on certain fees, like if a recording charge.
I'm saying if the seller gave a credit, let's say the seller gave a
Oh.
credit within that 3
No, the
months.
seller cannot give the buyer a credit. Unless, if they have the HUD-1 and then, they're waiting the 3 days, and during that 3 days, the seller needs to give the buyer a credit for something, that'll start the whole process over again, because you're changing that bottom line. Yes.
So, but hold on, we've kind of been dealing with this already, with having issues with doing escrows, and lenders not wanting credits on the HUD-1. So
Right.
imagine, I don't think this is gonna change our walkthroughs quite as much, because you did your walkthrough 7 days out, the house is not vacant, they're still living. So
Right.
You still have to probably wanna do a full nother walkthrough. So I think we're probably gonna be still in the same boat, but if the seller side can change, I think the best.
You know what, you're talking about the seller, and let me see, I think there might be a percentage that they would allow. Let me see. Okay, so basically, here's the rules of whether or not what's going to trigger the change. So we have what's called the no tolerance fees, which are fees paid to the creditor, a mortgage broker, or an affiliate. Fees paid to an unaffiliated third party if the creditor did not permit the consumer to shop for third-party services provided for settlement services. Transfer taxes. So those things, that is the no tolerance. Now, in a case where you have your credit, you're going to have to get that approved with the lender, and the lender is going to decide what they're going to do with the credit. So that's where the big problem will come in. So instead of sitting at the closing table and putting it on real quick, you're going to have to get approval.
So Karen and Al, so how do you guys deal with that? There is a last minute credit.
We put it on and we have to have reapprove. If it doesn't change the APR or the interest
Right.
rate, it's not gonna trigger a
say, but what if it's more than 30 days? Then we gotta start the 7-day process over, right? So keep it under 90.
A window company or.
I think the seller side doesn't matter, it's still, and that's one of the best methods, because sometimes,
If you credit the buyer, they could write a check to.
yep, you just have to have time to get that estimate, get the actual contractor out there, and then the seller company writes the check directly to the contractor. Which is the best method, because it doesn't trip off, you don't even have to get it approved by the lender.
I think that is a perspective that it's gonna have to put in time frame here. Sarah's must be maybe 14 days. Because you might right away get it done, rather than waiting for the last, 30 days in and then wait around for a contract. Get it all done. And then you do it all free.
I can't hear you.
I said, I think in the home inspection addendums now, we're gonna have to require that repairs be made within 14 days. Not give them the whole time to settlement to do it, get the receipts. Take a look at what's going on so that we know if something's coming.
Yeah, so if there's something that was not finished, walk through, they decide, okay, we're trying to get that credit. I mean, would that also put it back? As long as it's approved by the lender.
Yeah, because it does say the bottom line is that, changes of any terms of the transactions, especially the terms of the loan or the financial relationship between any of the parties, it must be disclosed to the settlement and the loan officer prior to closing. So it looks like it may not trigger as long as, like I said, the APR, as long as that's not being affected, but it has to be approved before you go to closing. The lender has to say that it's okay, which I think is pretty much how it is now. And you have, we're putting it on there and getting a HUD approval, so.
But sometimes that does trip off some issues. Depending on the lenders.
Right. And I guess it's also whether or not it's, a seller credit or seller paid closing costs. If they're moving items over to a seller side as opposed to just putting the credit on the front of the HUD or, however they do it.
So that actually
now.
makes a difference?
Well, I imagine that if a seller's picking up a portion of the buyer's closing cost, then that will affect the APR. That's going to trigger a reset. But if they're only putting a credit on the front of the HUD, then it would not. Because if you're taking the buyer's paying their closing costs and all of a sudden you're moving the buyer's closing cost over to the seller side, the APR is going to change.
Say that again. What's the distinction?
Okay, so if you have a seller that's agreed to pay, like at the walkthrough or what, okay, say that we'll pay $10,000 in closing costs or $5,000 or $500 in closing costs. If the closing costs are being affected, like the buyer is now, or the seller's now paying a portion of the buyer's closing costs, that's going to change the APR because the lender's fees are all calculated in the APR when you do the APR. So if you're taking fees away from the buyer and putting them on the seller side, that is going to change. If you're putting a $500 credit on the front of the HUD-1, that's not changing the APR.
That's important if you are maxing out. Sometimes you have to do that. If you max out,
Right.
the seller allow credit and you need to give the buyer.
Exactly. If you're playing with figures, you might want to be real careful so that, at the last minute, you're kind of not 500 here, 500 there. You want to kind of like up front, make sure that you're squared away with all that. Because if something starts moving over, if the seller is picking up any of the buyer's charges during that contract period, you need to make sure that you're kind of on top of that. So when that closing disclosure comes out, that those charges aren't on the buyer side if they're not supposed to be on the buyer side, or if the seller's agreed to pick up those charges.
And agents' access to the disclosure form is it? We just have to work with the lenders to make sure we get a copy or the title company.
And not too sure yet if you're going to get it from your settlement company or you're going to get it from your lender. So that's kind of one of those things that, and the settlement company should have access to it the same day that the lenders completed it. So that, hey, they can go ahead and when it's being mailed out to the borrowers, there's really not any reason why it can't be emailed to you. But that's assuming that the settlement company is getting it the day that it's prepared by the lender. And see, the lender is going to be concerned with getting it out of their office. They're not really too concerned with getting it all to the settlement company and the real estate agent. So you might have to chase your closing disclosure down on the day that it's released, just to, because the bank's going to be really concerned with getting it out into the borrower, unless you have a loan officer that's really nice and as soon as it's done, shoots it to you, you can make those arrangements, but really, I don't know where they're going to come from.
So does the 1/8 point rule change whether it's a lender credit or a seller credit, or is it the same?
It's whatever's going to affect the buyers. So if it's going to affect that APR, whether it's coming from the seller or the lender, it's still going to, either way. Yep, either way. So basically, the big change is, of course, what the settlement sheets look like, and your the good faith estimate. Those documents are changing, and the last minute closing. So basically, you're closing a week before you go to the closing table, before you consummate your loan. So basically, 1 week beforehand. Yep.
The buyer really isn't privy to what the seller debt is.
Right.
And likewise, the seller's not going to be privy to what the buyer's going to do.
Right. These sellers, well, to be honest with you, I haven't seen a seller's side by itself yet. Like, I haven't seen an actual, hey, here's what it'll look like. Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, when I first looked at, there was a seller's signature line on these buyer disclosures at first. Nope, okay, they've removed it.
On the summary of transactions, there's sellers, transactions, and buyers.
On the seller side, yes, and this is just kind of a mock one here. But this is the one, yeah, this is the one that, oh no, this does have the seller's transaction on it, I'm sorry. If you go to summary of transactions, which is on page 3, that does show the seller's cash from closing. So it is on page 3. So the seller, the buyer, the seller will not see this document, but the buyer will see the seller's cash to buyer or cash to seller on page 3, is it does disclose that. It's the page 1 of the original settlement statement is kind of what it looks like. I mean, what this is a longer version of the settlement statement. I mean, all the categories are still there, but they basically put columns: a seller's column, a buyer's column, a lender's column. This is supposed to make it a lot easier, but I don't know how much easier. A 2-page HUD is now 8 pages long. I don't know how much easier that is. But the thing is this is not just your HUD-1. This is your truth in lending, as well as your HUD-1. And basically what they did is, if you look through here, this is the package that if the buyer goes to closing, this tells them exactly what their terms are of their loan, who to contact, because it'll have your contact information on it. It'll have the settlement agent's contact information on it. It'll have everybody's name and telephone number that they've done business with this transaction on this document. This is the document that's supposed to be well, you said you didn't understand what your loan was all about, so here it is in plain English. So it has your interest rate, your monthly loan, payments, everything that's important, so to speak, regarding the loan is now in this little booklet that they're going to give you at the closing table for the buyers. So it tells them, do you have a prepayment penalty? Yes or no? So instead of them, like your truth in lending used to have all that information on it, now the HUD and the truth in lending are one document. And they don't call it, now they call this TRID, it's TRID instead of RESPA. We're all used to like hearing RESPA disclosure, RESPA this, RESPA that. Well, that's all changing because everybody's coming together now, and that's the new TRID rule, is because they're all coming together to make one document. So this will be the big, everything that you need to know. This is the one that actually goes out 3 days ahead of time. Yeah, and I apologize. I had thought that maybe you guys have already seen what this thing looks like, because in our industry, this has been flying around for months now. They're really trying to understand what the new HUD's gonna look like. Regarding the loan and one little sweet package.
It is very comprehensive.
It's a lot of information. I don't know that this HUD is any easier to read. Yeah.
It's more than it's going to impact coinciding settlements. Unless everybody knows that
Yeah.
everybody's ready to go.
Yep.
But I think it's still make people doing things outside of closing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I pretty much see. Look, we work out outside the table so we don't have to. Unfortunately, yes. Is there any questions that I didn't answer, or if anybody wants a card because they have a question that I can't answer, I can find out. Yep.
Right.
What are the general criteria for
Basically, your insurance, anything that licenses and insurance, that's really it. Yep, and those just basically have to stay out. Like, if you're using a guy, like the insurance I get here, and then you're covered that way. Oh, I need something. Oh, I never use that guy anymore. You have it. So it's basically the same thing. And they have to keep us whole. Yeah. Right. Almost. Yeah. I mean, well, it's pretty standard. Yes. Well, here's how they're going to manage that. They're saying that Wells So what happens is they're going to I think try to get this out here.
Marlene and I just need one second. Thank you.
So that's all it is. Right. So the only way they can basically keep costs down is by so which means that if you don't, as we're trying to start, starts working, you can watch that. You're off. Settlement companies right now really have to follow around. And basically, it's just more common sense. Right, exactly. So, and not only now they don't just say, oh, my now you have to every in that line item, everybody's licensing, continuing education, SunTrust, like right now, SunTrust gave everybody July 1st, not August 1st, July 1st. So they said July 1st, we want getting material in our office. So basically,
Anyone else have any questions? We're running out of time.
Anybody else have any
closing inside the platform. That's where everybody's gonna talk to each other.
All right. We'll be here afterwards. Teresa will be here if you have any questions as well. So thank you guys very much for coming up. And we'll see you guys in September.
Yeah.